Hey guys, I'm Clint Cannon with ATS Diesel, and today I'm going to follow up on part 3 of our diesel emissions talk. So if you just finished up with part 2, I kind of talked about the after treatment system, the DPF, and the entire system that goes behind the exhaust once we get out of the engine and we go into the after treatment system, kind of how all that works. And as you're kind of gathering by now that really is what governs how you build power in an engine today. Of course, 07 when the after treatment systems came out, the stage 1 was kind of basically a Nox trap that didn't use urea, and then around 11 to 13, depending on the manufacturer, then urea was introduced in the system. And I talked a little bit about that, how the urea helps with the NOx that come out of the tailpipe. So what I'm going to focus on today is what happens before you get to the after treatment system. And that after treatment system, of course, is once you come off the turbo and your black smoke and your poisonous gases are kind of flowing through the exhaust, then we have to treat them. Well, we can only treat them to a degree of what we have to work with. Otherwise, if you send too much of that nasty gas and black smoke, unburnt fuel out of the engine into the after treatment system, then your after treatment system is basically overworked and it shuts down the engine, so the engine doesn't work. And that's really why the DPF deletes got so incredibly popular, from 07 to pretty much where we are today. And along with that is the technology didn't really exist to deal with the after treatment systems, or the after treatment systems didn't have the technology in them to work with what the engine manufacturers produced, at least in the aftermarket world. So there's a lot of things that kind of came to a head, that everything kind of came together. Well, today's day and age, we have the newer trucks, really like 11, 12, 13 and newer. All the technology is pretty solid. In fact, it's extremely solid. And I'm going to take today and kind of explain what we do up in front of the engine. So the after treatment system works, so we can have a high horsepower, 600, 700, 800 horsepower diesel that we used to have in the old days, or we used to have from deleting these trucks, but we can get that legally. So, not only do we get the reliability and maintain our gas mileage, but we also get the big horsepower and the big torque numbers that we were seeing from the older engines, and everything's legal. So, this is kind of where we're starting. So this happens to be a 6.7 Cummins that's in front of me here, and what we have on it is our compounds. But before we really get into the complexity of the compounds and the twin fueler, I'm going to kind of talk about some of the basic stuff we have to do in the engine to start with. So with any emissions on engine today, we have the engine, we have an EGR cooler, you have a turbocharger, you have a fuel injection system. And with those couple elements, they're very tightly wrapped together. The way you have to ingest fuel into the engine, burn it in the cylinder, the temperature at which you burn it controls a lot of your invisible gases, and of course the quantity has a lot to do, or everything to do, with the soot load that it makes, or the black smoke. And of course, how much air goes into the engine will kind of help compensate how it burns the fuel, and you get rid of the black smoke. So, stepping back a little bit on these older motors, the reason that the newer motors are so incredibly responsive when they're deleted, because the torque curve of the engine, basically, when you're talking about a single turbocharger, when you're dealing with a really small turbocharger, that means it spools up very quickly, it builds boost early, and of course, it forces air into the engine, so you have that airflow to actually burn the fuel. And anytime you inject fuel and it begins to burn, if you don't have the air to support it, then essentially, instead of turning into an explosion and pushing the piston down and burning the fuel so you don't get the black smoke, if you don't have the airflow to support it, then you basically get a lot of soot, which is the black smoke, which kills your DPF. So it's that ratio. In older days also, especially uncapped engines, say that they didn't have an after treatment system on them, then you could literally just put a program into it, run bigger injectors, get more fuel, and you have an explosion of power, this huge increase in power. And not only do you get the increase in power from the additional fuel, but the turbo would come to life much more quickly because of the extra heat that's coming out of the engine. and it literally is all that extra fuel ignites, and it literally fills up the exhaust manifold, and it kind of makes a blowtorch effect. And that expanding gas would really hit the turbo and drive the turbine. So you get a lot of additional airflow immediately into the engine. Well, the problem with that or the problem wasn't with the open exhaust systems or deleted truck, is you have a turbo that's really small, that's designed to spool up relatively quickly with a small amount of fuel. You give it a lot of fuel, it gives you a ton of power on the bottom, but it also is, because of that soot loading, or all that soot that's in the manifold that's burning, that's creating the big expansion in the exhaust manifold and driving the turbo, you're still not burning all of it, so it would go out the exhaust system in the form of black smoke. So that's why you would generally see, in just about every case, a factory diesel, stock diesel, you put a tuner in it, or a module, whatever that is, you increase rail pressure, whatever that is, to really give it that increase in power on the bottom, then it would give you a huge increase in power immediately to the rear wheels, but you would have that puff of smoke. Well, we can't be afforded that luxury these days with the aftertreatment system, because as I mentioned in part 2 of this series, that anytime you have black smoke or unburnt fuel that you're having to deal with in the aftertreatment system, then you're basically forcing that filter to capture that soot load, which is your black smoke, and it begins to basically fill up, and that begins to drive back pressure. Well, as soon as you start driving back pressure, then that means you have more resistance on the engine, so you have less ability for airflow to come into the engine and actually charge the cylinders to burn the fuel. So you can see what kind of happens. It's this point of diminishing returns. You increase the pulse width or the rail pressure, or basically fuel quantity into the engine a little bit, and then this chain of events begins to happen. So that's pretty much why the manufacturers, from the factory, they have kind of smalled down the turbos, and the turbos have gotten a little bit tighter. If anything, the engines got bigger. Like we went from a 5.9 to a 6.7. The turbocharger stayed about the same, but a VNT, a variable turbine, was basically added, so it would help kind of accelerate that turbine a little bit quicker, and the bigger engine would give it a little bit more airflow. So with the minimal amount of fuel that's being injected into the engine, then you would have the heat, not necessarily the soot or the black smoke, but you would have the heat that would spool the turbo. So then the turbo would begin to spool, and it's monitored airflow from the inlet, from ambient, into the turbocharger, into the front of the intercooler. It condenses a little bit more, goes into the engine, so you have a nice, clean, cool air charge going into the cylinder. Very high pressure injection, so it atomizes really well. Again, all these steps help get the fuel to burn in the cylinder. Then it goes into the cylinder and it begins to ignite. And then once it ignites, then you're yielding as much power, a much more high efficiency of burn out of that fuel quantity. And then the air exits the engine, and it's mostly clean. It's not really black. I mean, it might just have a little bit of gray residue or just a little bit of black residue, but for the most part, it's a very clean mixture. And then that heat expansion in the manifold will drive the turbo. Then the turbo begins to ramp. Well, with an emissions on system, it's such a fine balance that turbocharger, once it begins to spool, then it begins to increase boost, and then you can continue to add fuel to it, which the manufacturers have done a really good job of having the calibration, the turbocharger match, everything put together so the aftertreatment system lives. So if you kind of followed me, as soon as you start to tamper or modify the amount of fuel that's injected into the engine, or timing, or pressure, then all of those dynamics begin to change. So when we tune a emissions-on vehicle, it's much, much different than the old days. The old days, you would open up a table, give it some more pulse width, maybe raise some pressure, give it some more timing. Well, these are the things that happen. We give it some more pulse width, we get more fuel, we get more power, it drives the turbo, we generate black smoke. So you have to be very careful increasing pulse width. We give it more rail pressure throughout the system. That's pseudo-safe in certain areas, but you really have to monitor what happens between CO and NOx as it's going out the tailpipe. Remember, because that's another thing you have to deal with in the aftertreatment system. So every time we make a little change like that, it's balancing against the turbo. You know, the emissions on diesels have really turned into more of a kind of the way you tune a gas motor. Gas motors are very similar. Your ratios are incredibly important. Again, in the older days, or deleted trucks, fuel ratios kind of didn't matter. You know, I wouldn't say most, but many backyard tuners and, you know, just throwing turbos on and that, you know, that you could get away with anything. You could take an older diesel and just put literally any turbo you wanted onto it, and it's going to run. It's not going to shut you down. It might not drive great. Generally, a very popular thing to do in older days is put a huge turbo on it, say 66 millimeter turbo from a 60 millimeter. So the 60 millimeter turbo obviously spools very quickly because it's light. So you hit the turbine, it spins the compressor wheel, starts to make boost. Well, you kind of run out of power, you know, at that 350, you know, 375 horsepower range with like a 60-ish millimeter turbo. You put a 64 or 66 millimeter on it, then all of a sudden that guy will support 600 horsepower, you know, maybe 650 horsepower. Problem is you find your torque curve drops. And again, in the older diesels, that didn't make that big of a deal because you didn't have to worry about spiking the bigger turbo with fuel to get it to spool up, to get your fuel, because the black smoke would just kind of roll out the exhaust pipe. And if it just rolls out the exhaust pipe, there's no harm done to the engine or to the aftertreatment system because there's no filter in it. Well, we add a filter to it, and now we have to be very concerned about the fuel ratio. And the air-fuel ratio is absolutely more important than anything we're doing when we're tuning these motors. So, you know, over the last 5 years, I mean, we've spent, you know, just a ton of time understanding how the system works and combining a lot of gas technologies and you know, what your fuel ratios are, and, you know, using all the sensors on the engine, really using your altitude graphs, you know, in the tuning software and everything else. So every one of these modifications that we do today, whether you're changing the turbo, changing manifolds, changing intakes, adding additional fuel pumps, all of these things you have to take into account when you're adding hardware so your tune actually matches it. And that's today why you're seeing, you know, our kits, you know, we don't just sell a compound turbo kit and let you put it on the vehicle. For instance, this kit, if you just put it on without tuning, the vehicle will literally limp within about 2 to 3 minutes, just because the airflow ratios, the map versus the boost ratios, they get out of whack because we're increasing the airflow so much that the computer doesn't know what to do with it, so we have to calibrate around that. Well, nice thing about it is with any diesel, as you increase airflow, that you have the ability to burn more fuel. The more fuel you inject into the engine, the more power it's going to make. So again, it comes to a ratio. One of the things I'm going to talk about today is kind of like a stage 1 turbo increase, a stage 2 turbo increase, and then compound turbocharging. Today, the engines are built very well. You know, they'll support in that 650 horsepower range, 700 horsepower range, bottom ends, the rods, the heads, everything's good for them. So really, what we get to work with is all the stuff on the outside of the motor. You know, how do we maintain the responsiveness and the drivability and the gas mileage and keeping regens down, and overall the fun of driving, let these things actually tow heavy without overheating and derating. So we have pretty much our cake and eat it too. Well, in this system, this, like I say, is the 6.7 Cummins, and whether it's the 6.6 Duramax or the 6.7 Ford, they're both V8s, or the Cummins, very similar. The theory of operation is all the same. The hardware is very different. So today I'm going to talk about the compounding effect of what happens with these engines and kind of how we go. So before I get really heavy into the turbos, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to talk about the fuel system. Reason is, you know, again, talking about the manufacturers, how they design these systems so well. One of the things they've gotten really good about is they give us just enough hardware to get to the power level that their calibrations are certified to. And I think everybody's familiar with the CP4. Well, the CP4 debuted on the Duramax some time ago, and it turned out to be kind of a horrific nightmare because of the reliability. And really what drives that is the CP4 builds higher pressure. It's not necessarily a higher volume pump, but it doesn't have the durability of the CP3. So everybody has switched over to the CP4. Ford has been running the CP4 for quite some time now. Recently on the 19 Dodge or the Ram trucks, they've moved over to a CP4. And the CP4s are really good pumps, but if you start pushing them, then they have a catastrophic failure and they explode, they blow up. So a couple of things you can do about that. One is we offer a nice little filtration kit, goes in the high pressure side. So if you do have a failure, it catches the debris. So you just wipe out your CP4 pump and you don't have to worry about trashing out the entire fuel system, filling the tank full of metal. So it literally turns it into a $2,000 repair instead of like a $13,000 or $14,000 repair. So that's kind of beside the note, but the real key to keeping a CP4 alive, instead of necessarily worrying about it blowing up or having to change it out, is don't overstress it. The way you don't overstress it is you add another fuel pump to it. So twin CP3s, additional fuel pumps or multiple fuel pumps on a high pressure injection system has generally always been sought after. It's like the last thing you do. You put bigger injectors in it and you turn up the fuel with a tune or whatever it is, basically open up the injectors to give it more fuel. And everything that you do to that is going to increase the amount of volume of fuel that goes into the engine. Problem is you're increasing the amount of volume that goes into the engine, you're creating a huge leak down or upstream, and that's basically a high pressure pump. So your high pressure injector pump, its responsibility is to build volume basically, and then of course it's restricted at the injectors, and that restriction at the injectors is what creates your pressure. Well, the pressure is what is absolutely crucial to a clean burn in a diesel. If you don't maintain your high pressure rail, say if you don't maintain 30,000, 28,000, 35,000 PSI, whatever the engine's commanding, then when the nozzle opens, then the fuel kind of flutters out instead of sprays really finely. That really fine, high intensity spray that turns that liquid fuel, aerates it into a bunch of small particles and lets the oxygen molecules get around it, which is the boost of the engine. That is what enables the fuel to burn quickly and cleanly and controls the amount of NOx and CO that you're generating, and equally important is that's what burns the fuel so you don't get the soot. The soot is what kills your DPF. So as soon as you turn fuel up a little bit by putting a program in your stock engine, then you very, very quickly get to that point of diminishing returns that you increase the amount of volume of fuel going into the engine, but you begin to decrease the amount of pressure that you have in the rail. And as that pressure drops, that means that the CP4 or the high pressure injector pump has to work harder and harder and harder to try to maintain that huge leak. So as RPM goes up and pulse width goes up, then rail pressure begins to drop. Again, on a diesel that had an open exhaust, and especially with the CP3, it didn't really matter because the CP3 doesn't have the limitations that the CP4 does, so it wouldn't blow up, and the exhaust wouldn't clog up because there was no filter there. Well, the newer trucks, you have a filter on it, so you have to really start your building emissions power in the fuel system. That means the optimal rail pressure to make sure that when the computer is commanding a given PSI of pressure, let's call it 30,000 PSI, that injector opens up and it opens up beyond stock, so you get more fuel into the engine to build higher power levels. Then you maintain the rail pressure so your high pressure injector pump doesn't stress out. So it's kind of equivalent to taking a large boat, say a 30-foot bayliner, and you have one motor on it and you give it gas and one motor kind of struggles to get it out of the water and you finally plane. You put two motors on it, you give it half the fuel and it jumps out of the water and it planes. So having a bigger injector pump, in essence, when you have two of them. So when we add our CP3 pump to it for all of these emissions on kits, once we get up above a stock turbo, we generally go to a secondary injector pump and we add the second CP3. So the CP3 essentially allows the CP4 to run at half its duty cycle. The CP3 does most of the work. It generally does half to 60% of the work. And the CP4 there is just to kind of balance. So both units are actually running at very high power levels. They're running a lot lower than stock stress, in essence. So you don't have all the stress on the CP4. It doesn't blow up. It maintains the longevity of it, all those types of things. So again, when we're talking about building bigger power, increasing power levels just a little bit above stock, you know, and in a lot of cases, you know, adding the CP3 to your existing CP4 is going to, well, in every case, it's going to increase the longevity and reduce, and certainly increase your reliability, because you're not having to worry about the CP4 blowing up because it's working so hard. Remember, these guys are working, you know, at about 70% of their designed capability, you know, just with a stock engine. You know, you're fully loaded, heading up the hill, wide open throttle, you know, building 350 horsepower, you know, that CP4 is working really, really hard. And that's what tends to kill them. So adding the CP3, letting it split the load, then the CP4, instead of working up at this level, it just starts to work down at this level. And it's just kind of chugging along. So the other thing it gives us is, as soon as you open the injectors and you are demanding fuel, then you're going to have a drop in rail, right? So that means the injector pump has to catch up really quickly. And we're talking microseconds, but the fact is you open those injectors and you begin to drain the rail out. You want to make sure you have that volume of fuel, so you have the bandwidth or the punch or the horsepower in that fuel to fill the rail and to keep that pressure where you want it. So as the injectors are firing, that you're always up on the top limit of your rail pressure, you're injecting fuel. One of the more finite things that it gives us is, we're talking Nox Control. And the number one hardest thing that we fight with the EPA to build power in these motors is NOx. As soon as we increase the cylinder temperatures of these engines, that's where NOx get out of control, especially at low RPM. So you're at low RPM, we're adding fuel, raising timing, you know, is a huge one, right? We raise timing, power goes up in these engines because they like timing. Well, increasing timing increases NOx by an alarming rate. So now you're like, well, now what I do? You know, I want to increase some fuel, I want to increase some timing, get the power where it goes, but now the after treatment system is saying, nope, this isn't going to work because your NOx is too high. Urea starts injecting, the urea starts to drop because you're increasing your NOx so much that the after treatment system starts to react to that, so it starts driving the urea usage, which, you know, we don't like wasting all that urea to deal with this. And then, of course, guess what happens? The EGR comes in. So EGR, you know, really is one of those things that it really is kind of our friend. Well, EGR has always been a problem in the past. Now, let's back up a little bit. The big problem with EGR has been on generally trucks that, one, you know, idle a whole lot, but really trucks that have had a little bit of a tune in them. The system weren't really refined that well. We start soot loading. For every bit of soot that we're thinking about putting out the exhaust and we're going into the after treatment system, well, that soot, guess where it's going? It's going right back into the EGR system. So by us really working on making sure that we have fuel atomization, adding the CP3, having the right tune, that means the exhaust coming out of the engine is clean. The exhaust coming out of that engine is clean. It's not full of black smoke. It's going through the EGR cooler. Guess what the EGR cooler doesn't have to do? The EGR cooler doesn't have to act as a filter for all that soot. And as soot gets bigger and bigger, you know, fine soot is kind of one thing. As soot gets right to a point, the unburnt fuel is more like globs of mud. I mean, it's like gooey, oily substance, and it likes to cling the thing. And that's exactly what absolutely kills EGRs. So EGR performance and EGR reliability is vastly extended if you have good atomization, good tuning. And that's what we really focus on. Let's make sure we maintain all of that stuff in the engine, you know, before we just try to build a whole bunch of power. So kind of working through that. Now, that doesn't mean that, guys, just like on the gas motors, you know, an EGR is a maintenance item. You know, if you think your EGR is going to go consistently 100,000 miles without having to maintenance it or clean it, you're wrong. I mean, that's part of the maintenance cycle. It's not a big deal. Pull the EGR off, clean it, put it back on. You know, I recommend every, you know, 40,000, 50,000 miles is a great rule of thumb. Depending on your climate, what kind of tuning you've had, yeah, you know, fuel, all these other parameters, and is going to have, you know, what your driving conditions are. That's going to have everything to do with how often your EGR gets sooted up. But just think of it as a maintenance item. It's not expensive. It's not a big deal. It's just like these gasser cars. You know, they have the motor vacs, you know, been around forever. As we run them hotter, you know, you have less EGR soot loading, that kind of stuff. You know, these things run hot, just get used to it. You know, today's trucks, they don't use, you don't pay attention to EGT gauges. These guys are running hot. I mean, they're running, 16, 17, 1800 degrees. That's just the fact of it. It's not a bad thing. The materials in the turbos, the materials in the manifolds, they're designed for it. That heat is used to keep the after-treatment system lit up. You know, more heat you can keep in the after-treatment system, in the DPF, the more passively it's going to basically regenerate and keep the soot burnt, that does actually escape the turbos and go into the after-treatment system. So don't freak out about, 1200, 1300 degrees, 1400 degrees. That's a thing of the past. Open exhaust vehicles, the early 5.9s, you had to worry about those things, melting at the higher temperatures. The newer vehicles, they're designed to run at those higher temperatures. Just monitor your coolant temperature. When you see, basic rule of thumb is when you see coolant temperature start to creep, that means the engine is getting beyond its ability to extinguish that heat, either out of the exhaust or out of the intercooler or out of the radiator. So once that begins to creep, you get up there, in the higher levels, then you start worrying about it and back off the throttle a little bit. You're not really going to damage the motor. So, now that we kind of talked about how the fuel system is reacting with the engine and those types of things, then we really get to talk about the fun stuff that really builds us the power. A stage 1 VFR, stage 2 VFR gets you some increases. The way we get those increases is obviously open up the turbine section, get more airflow, which reduces the amount of back pressure, which lets more air into the engine. A much more efficient compressor housing and compressor wheel. It's a bigger compressor wheel, so we get more airflow in, but you still are limited to how much airflow you can actually pull into a single compressor and compress and maintain the efficiency coming out of it. And the efficiency means how much heat is coming out of that compressor housing, creating the expansion, creating back pressure. So again, you get gains, but it's not these explosive gains that we all want to see in the diesels. By compounding, now we're talking. You start compounding, you start adding an additional turbo on top of the entire system, then you're talking airflow. And airflow, now we're talking we can start adding fuel. We can start adjusting that timing and start doing the things that we really like. And all of a sudden power really starts to get aggressive. And that's what I get excited about. So this is your 6.7 Cummins, of course. Your factory turbos down below, this is our VFR. That's our stage 1 VFR. Typically, when we compound, I always like to stay with the stage 1 because I like to run a smaller turbo on the bottom side. That way you can lean on it harder, you can run more fuel on the bottom, you can get that small turbo zipped up quickly, making boost. So all of a sudden now you get that guy on the bottom running, then you can transition in the big turbo. So again, a big common mistake in my opinion, especially street vehicles in the past, open exhaust diesels, guys would always come in like, hey, I want to go with the biggest turbos you got. I'm like, what do you want to do? Like, I want an 800 horsepower street. Like, okay, why do you want 2 big turbos? Why do you want to run a big, small turbo on the bottom so it takes longer to spool up and then you finally catch up to your big turbo? Let's go with a smaller turbo on the bottom, get that thing up there quickly so it's more responsive like a gas motor, build the boost, and then we'll transition in the big turbo. So when you kind of think about that, that is absolutely the key with compounding. Compounding, you want to do everything possible to lean on your small turbo, get that thing up quickly, and then once you get up in that 200 horsepower range, you're completely transferred over into the big charger. Now you get the compounding effect. Well, with compounding, you get not only the increase of the big turbo, this is our 6,000 turbo that's feeding the second turbo, but you also, with compounding, it's not a twin turbo, it's a compound. With compounding, you get the increase of the efficiency because the big wheel keeps it compressed and it runs in its map. When it's efficient, that means the heat that is coming out of the compressor is not expanded so much that you're creating a back pressure condition. It's in the compressor map. And then you're running airflow into the second turbocharger, and the second turbocharger doesn't know that it's getting force-fed air, but it is. So it's getting force-fed air, so it steps it up a ratio. So now you have, say, 20 PSI of boost into that compressor, and the secondary compressor, your small turbo, your high-pressure turbo, compresses it again, and then it picks it up a stage, but it doesn't have it doesn't have the inefficiency of having to go from atmospheric to 40 psi. It's going from 20 psi to 40 psi. So now what you're doing is you're running that compressor way down in its map, which means it's very efficient. So the key is you want the bulk of air, okay? You want as much oxygen in that given space as possible to burn that fuel. That's why we have intercoolers. So, you compress it efficiently in your low pressure stage, and you more efficiently compress it in your high pressure stage. Then it goes to the intercooler and it goes in the engine. And then you have that high pressure injection and it all burns and temperatures are really nice and low in the cylinder. Guess what? You just made the perfect combination to have your maximum density inside the air, inside the chamber, inside the cylinder with high pressure fuel, that you just exploded that fuel and you turn it into power, and then what comes out of the exhaust is clean. So now you don't soot load your EGR and you don't soot load your after treatment system. So you start to see how this whole thing comes to effect. Well, I was kind of talking about heat, right? Well, heat to the after treatment system. This is one of our key pieces on the Cummins to really make this work. So this is quite a piece, but you'll see it's kind of on the engine here, right? Well, what happens here is the exhaust comes out of the manifold, it goes through the variable turbine, right? And then it comes out, and as it goes into here, this becomes the beginning of our turbine housing, right? Because a turbine housing, essentially what that is if you were to take like a cone, a parking cone, and you were to take that cone and wrap it around and connect it from the big side to the small side, that is basically how the airflow goes into a turbine housing and wraps around that cone, and as it's getting smaller, it's being driven into the turbine wheel. And it hits the turbine wheel and spins, and that's what drives your compressor. Well, this manifold, a couple things happen. We build a big banjo fitting in this sort portion of it, so as the flow comes out of the turbo and it's swirling, we need to break that swirl up as quickly as possible, because airflow that's doing this is not going from point A to point B, it's all tumbling up, right? So we want to take that airflow and straighten it out. So we go into a banjo fitting, straighten it out, and then we start our turbine housing right here. So now we have this real gradual flow. We basically lengthen the turbine housing, and then it goes into the big turbine housing. So now we've most efficiently converged that air into the turbine housing, which is this guy, right? See how that kind of starts? It starts down here and it tapers and it goes all the way around, and then it drives in that turbine wheel. And then we suck out as much of that energy as possible from the exhaust system, and it's driving the compressor to drive the compressed air in the small turbo, and then that wasted energy comes through here. Well, most of the heat is kept in this manifold. That's why I made it a big cast piece. So as that heat comes out and this stays hot, then most of that heat signature goes from the small turbo and it goes right out the back, and then it drives to the DPF. We want the heat at the DPF. Having all that heat, or as much heat as possible in the DPF, means that we're not going to have to spray additional raw fuel to actively ignite that DPF. So pretty much what you get, this system, running, we have this system, 600, 700, 800 horsepower models. Running the system in that 650 horsepower range, it literally never goes into regen. It literally is always passively regenerating, because we're keeping the heat in the system, letting the after treatment system do its job, but more importantly, with all the increased airflow, we're burning it in the cylinder. That means that we're not even generating all the black smoke, all the soot loading, because of really good tuning, additional CP3, having that rail pressure when we want it, and then of course all the additional airflow, it burns it in the cylinder. So you burn that in the cylinder, comes out the engine cleaner, then the after treatment system's nice and happy. So that's kind of an idea of the technology, how you kind of have to wrap all these together. Looking at your injection pump, your time, your tuning, how the turbos are fit, the sizing of them. This system we offer it in one turbo size. This is the Aurora 6000. We have the VFR, stage 1 VFR. I'll talk more in further episodes on how some of our single turbos work in the tuning, but for the most part, if you're looking for the reliability, how everything goes together, this is a pretty good baseline. So anyway, stay tuned to our emissions on episodes. Have many more to come. Next, we're going to actually take what we've learned in the first part, second part, and the third part, and we're going to do all these modifications to a brand new 19 Ram, and we'll kind of take one piece at a time, do our twin fueler, do our software. We'll start introducing some of the emissions testing, how we're doing it, what the emissions stuff does, what you're looking for, what we can offer, how that works with California, federal EPA, all these things go together. So my goal is to educate you guys on exactly what we're doing, how we're doing it. It makes sense to you, then it's going to make sense where you put it on your truck. So stay tuned. Next series we'll start with the truck, and then we'll see how all this stuff works. So thanks.